The Young and the Restless spoilers. Victoria had always lived with a quiet ache inside her, a kind of unresolved tension that surfaced in the stillness of late nights and the lonely silence between high-powered meetings. It wasn't grief, not exactly, but something deeper and harder to name, a phantom instinct, a maternal voice that whispered to her from the inside out, telling her that something in her life had never truly clicked into place. People around her saw a woman who had everything. A powerhouse in Newman Enterprises, a daughter raised from tragedy, and a life rebuilt after betrayal and trauma. Yet for years, without understanding why, Victoria felt a subtle wrongness whenever she looked at Claire. She tried to suffocate that thought, bury it under guilt, reason, and compassion, telling herself it was only the residue of trauma left behind by Jordan's sick manipulation. But the suspicion lived in her bones, traveling with her like a shadow she could never outrun. She never voiced it because even allowing the question to exist felt cruel, cruel to Claire, cruel to herself, cruel to the very idea of motherhood. So Victoria tucked the doubt away, isolating it as something she needed to overcome, something she believed she would eventually silence as time softened the edges of her fear. But that day never came. Instead, the unease grew stronger as Claire settled into the Newman orbit, her confidence swelling in proportion to how quickly she began to feel entitled to forgiveness. Claire acted as if love and redemption were promised to her simply because she wanted them, as if she could rewrite the history of her crimes by smiling a little brighter, crying a little harder, or leaning more heavily into the family name she had almost destroyed. She believed in unconditional acceptance, believing that the Newmans, especially Victoria, would always bend to protect her. Claire carried herself with entitlement masquerading as vulnerability, and the more she behaved that way, the more Victoria's instinct sharpened. The mother in her, the real mother buried beneath years of grief, began whispering louder, "This child is not mine. Not the one I lost. Not the one I have mourned." Victoria tried to dismiss that instinct again, telling herself she was being unfair, that trauma made her paranoid, that Claire deserved a chance to rebuild her life. Yet the feeling didn't fade. Every time Claire reached out for affection, every time she begged for forgiveness, every time she wrapped herself in the Newman name, Victoria felt a strange emptiness, like hugging a memory that never belonged to her. She hated herself for it. She wanted to love Claire. She wanted that story to be real. But love cannot be fabricated, not when the heart knows its own truth. What cracked the world open wasn't a DNA test, or a confession, or some sudden revelation from Jordan's twisted past. It was something simple. Something quiet. Something miraculous. A mark. A birthmark. It happened on a day that wasn't meant to carry any significance at all. Victoria wasn't searching for answers, she wasn't dissecting Claire's past. She was merely walking through the Newman offices, lost in thought as she reviewed documents, navigating another storm of corporate chaos. But instinct pulled her attention sideways, toward a familiar voice echoing down the hallway. Audra Charles stood there, sleeves rolled up, gesturing sharply as she argued over a contract revision. And that was when Victoria saw it, one small, distinct marking on Audra's wrist. A birthmark shaped exactly like the one her newborn daughter had on her skin the day Victoria held her for the first and last time before the tragedy struck. A mark Victor himself had whispered about through tears. A mark doctors had documented. A mark she had burned into her memory, because it was all she had left of the child prematurely ripped from her arms. When she saw it on Audra, the world stopped breathing. For a moment, Victoria couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Couldn't make sense of her own body as the air around her thinned. It was as if the universe reached out with a single finger and tapped her chest, awakening every dormant instinct she had ever suppressed. Not fear. Not confusion. Recognition. Powerful, undeniable, primal recognition. Audra turned, confused by Victoria's stare, unaware that everything, the past, the present, the story of her own life, had just shattered into something unrecognizable. Victoria stepped closer, trembling, unable to stop herself. Logic flickered like a dying candle, trying to argue that this was impossible, but maternal instinct drowned it out in a single heartbeat. She reached out, brushing her fingers over the birthmark before she even realized she had moved. Audra froze, startled by the sudden intimacy, the intensity in Victoria's eyes. And then Victoria broke. The composure she had carried for years collapsed. Her breath hitched, her vision blurred, and emotion surged through her like a tidal wave too powerful to contain. She lunged forward, instinct overriding reason, arms wrapping around Audra with a desperation that startled them both. It wasn't just an embrace, it was a reclaiming, a reunion, a mother finding what she had been grieving for far too long. Victoria's voice came out fractured, soaked in emotion she could no longer hide. She apologized, over and over. Apologized for losing her, for not knowing, for every moment of pain Audra had suffered in a life that should have been protected by Newman love and power. Audra stiffened at first, bewildered, trapped in an embrace that made no sense. She had spent her life surviving, manipulating, rebuilding, pretending. She knew Victoria as an adversary, a rival, a woman she wanted to outsmart, not a mother. And yet the way Victoria held her, the raw collapse of her voice, the trembling conviction behind every apology, it cracked something inside Audra that she didn't even know she had. Questions raced through her mind, but Victoria didn't give her time to voice them. She began to explain everything in a breathless rush, the kidnapping, the deception, the misplaced child, the impossible miracle of a birthmark that matched the one she had memorized the day she gave birth decades ago. As Victoria spoke, terror began to bloom inside Claire. She had walked into the hallway just in time to see the embrace, just in time to hear enough to understand that everything she believed, everything she counted on, was slipping out of her hands. Claire had spent months constructing a fantasy in which she was the lost Newman daughter, a story she clung to as justification for forgiveness. But now she watched as Victoria held Audra with a tenderness she had never shown Claire, with a certainty Claire had never earned. Claire's confidence, once so smug and unwavering, dissolved into something jagged and panicked. She understood instantly what was coming. If she wasn't Victoria's daughter, then she wasn't special. If she wasn't special, then she wasn't forgiven. And if she wasn't forgiven, she would face punishment for everything she had done. The truth, once revealed, became a weapon forged by fate itself. Victoria pulled back from Audra, cupping her face gently, trying to offer comfort, trying to reassure her that none of this was her fault. Audra, trembling, could barely process a single word. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the manipulator, the strategist, the calculated mind moving through the corporate battlefield. She was simply a woman searching for the truth about her own identity, overwhelmed by the possibility that she had been robbed of her family, her history, and her rightful life. Claire tried to speak, to protest, to reclaim the narrative she had built around herself, but Victoria turned toward her with a gaze that could cut steel. Gone was the conflicted softness. Gone was the guilt. Gone was the compassion she had tried so desperately to force into existence. In its place was a clarity so sharp it made Claire flinch. Victoria finally understood. She finally knew why she had never felt that bond. She finally knew why forgiveness had felt forced, hollow, impossible. Because Claire had never been hers to love. And now that truth would reshape everything. As Victoria guided Audra away to get answers, Claire remained standing alone in the hallway, watching the destruction of the only identity she had left. She thought being a Newman would save her. She thought love would excuse her crimes. She thought the world owed her redemption. But the universe had never been on her side. And now that Victoria knew the truth, Claire would face consequences in ways she had never imagined, because the woman she manipulated, used, and emotionally toyed with was done being deceived. And for the first time, Claire realized the truth that everyone else had known long before the miracle of the birthmark. Newmans do not forgive easily. Newmans do not forget. And Newmans never allow themselves to be fooled twice. The moment Victoria guided Audra away, the hallway fell into an uncanny stillness, as if even the walls were waiting for Claire's reaction. She stood frozen, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, her mind scrambling for a version of reality that didn't destroy everything she had built. Her whole life, every manipulative smile, every carefully crafted act of remorse, every calculated plea for forgiveness, rested on the illusion that she was the lost Newman daughter. Without that, she was nothing more than a criminal forgiven out of pity. And Claire Weston refused to live in a world where she was nothing. Her eyes hardened as she stared at the direction Victoria had disappeared. The truth wasn't going to ruin her, she would ruin the truth. She had reinvented herself before, she could do it again. And this time, she had a target. A very clear target. Audra Charles. The woman who stole everything. The woman who didn't even know what she had. The woman who had the audacity to exist in the space Claire had carved for herself. Claire's jealousy curdled into something poisonous. In her mind, Audra wasn't the victim of a stolen childhood, she was the thief. A fraud. A woman who had somehow wormed her way into a destiny that was supposed to belong to Claire. The more Claire fixated on this belief, the more warped her thoughts became, twisting into a narrative in which Claire was the rightful daughter, and Audra was nothing more than an obstacle that needed to disappear. Claire moved silently down the hallway, her expression smooth, her mind sharpening into a weapon. She knew how to play the victim better than anyone else. She knew how to make people believe her tears, her trembling voice, her innocence. And she knew that if she played this right, she could turn the entire Newman family against Audra just as quickly as Victoria had embraced her. Because Claire had one advantage Audra didn't, she was willing to lie without remorse. Victoria, meanwhile, had led Audra into her office, closing the door behind them as if shutting out the world could protect the fragile truth between them. Victoria's voice shook as she explained the birthmark, the abduction, the decades of unanswered questions. Audra sat stunned, her breath shallow, her mind flickering between overwhelming disbelief and a strange, terrifying sense of belonging. For the first time, she wasn't trying to be strong or manipulative, she was simply trying to understand who she really was. It was too much, too fast, and yet some part of her recognized that familiar ache Victoria described. She had always felt misplaced, drifting, rootless despite every success she achieved. For years she had tried to build a life from dust, rarely admitting even to herself that something fundamental was missing. Now she realized, it wasn't ambition she lacked, but origin. Identity. A history that belonged to her. And Claire chose that vulnerable moment to strike. She burst into the room with perfect timing, eyes red as if she had been crying, hands trembling just enough to appear believable. Victoria jolted in surprise, her maternal instincts shifting instantly into protective mode, toward Audra. She stepped slightly in front of her, shielding her subconsciously. That movement alone made Claire's jealousy flare so brightly she almost forgot her performance. But she caught herself, twisting her expression into something wounded and fragile. "I need to talk to you," she said, voice cracking beautifully. "It's important. It's about Audra." Audra straightened, suspicion tightening her spine. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Claire saw their reactions, and her heart pounded with anxiety, but also exhilaration. She knew how to manipulate a crowd, how to weaponize a lie so thoroughly that even the target began to doubt their own truth. She had done it before. She could do it again. Claire stepped forward, letting her voice tremble like a string pulled too tight. "She's lying to you." Audra stiffened. "What?" "She's lying," Claire repeated, louder, her voice cracking perfectly. "About everything. I overheard her on the phone last week. She said she was going to use you, Victoria. She said she could turn the Newman name into her ticket to power." Audra's jaw dropped. "That's not true." But Claire talked over her, knowing timing was everything. "She said she would pretend to be your daughter if she ever had the chance. And when she saw how much guilt you carried after what Jordan did to us, she said it would be easy to manipulate you." She said you'd fall for anything if it made you feel like a mother again. Victoria's heart lurched painfully. The accusation hit precisely where Claire wanted it to, the deepest wound, the deepest fear. She watched Victoria swallow, watched her eyes flicker with uncertainty. This was the moment Claire lived for, the split second when a lie could reshape reality. Audra shook her head, horrified. Victoria, I never. But Claire wasn't finished. And the birthmark? Claire whispered, letting tears slip down her cheeks. I know why it looks the same. Audra showed it to me after I got out of the hospital. She said she got it tattooed to match the scar she had as a child, because she loved having something that made her feel special. Audra gasped, stunned. A tattoo? Are you insane? Victoria's expression trembled, torn between instinct and logic. She wanted to believe Audra. She felt the truth in her bones. But Claire wasn't stupid, she was attacking Victoria exactly where she was weakest. It's not a tattoo, Audra said, trying to steady her voice. This is a birthmark. I've had it since I was born. Claire staggered back as if devastated. I wanted to tell you sooner, she whispered, but I was afraid you'd stop loving me if you knew. And there it was, the dagger. The emotional blackmail. The implication that Victoria's newfound love for Audra was somehow a betrayal of Claire. The room thickened with tension. Audra felt the burn of injustice, her body trembling with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. She had spent her whole life fighting to belong somewhere, and now the moment she finally found the truth, someone was trying to rip it away. But this time, Claire had miscalculated. Because Victoria wasn't the same fragile woman Claire had manipulated months ago. Victoria closed her eyes briefly, taking a breath so deep it seemed to travel through every decade of pain she had endured. When she opened them again, there was clarity, not the sharp panic Claire hoped for, but something grounded and unmistakable. Claire, Victoria said softly, stop. Claire froze, tears still clinging to her lashes, but her expression flickered. Victoria stepped closer, her voice gentle but unshakably firm. I've lived with doubt for years. I know what my instincts feel like. And I know what it feels like to force myself to love someone I don't truly connect with. Claire's lips parted, horror beginning to form. And I do not need a DNA test to tell me who my daughter is, Victoria continued. My heart already knows. The silence that followed was suffocating. Audra covered her mouth, tears spilling despite her attempts to stay composed. Claire swayed as if struck, her lies collapsing inward like a dying star. She opened her mouth to argue, to salvage herself, but Victoria wasn't finished. And if you ever try to hurt Audra again, Victoria said quietly, dangerously, you will answer not only to me, but to the entire Newman family. Claire's mask shattered. All of her false vulnerability twisted into naked rage. She turned on Audra with a hatred so visceral it chilled the room. This should have been my life, she hissed. You stole it. Audra met her gaze without flinching. I stole nothing. You were never meant to be in her place. But Claire wasn't listening. Her world was burning, and she wanted someone, anyone, to burn with her. And as she stormed out of the room, moving with the determination of someone who has nothing left to lose, one truth crystallized. Claire wasn't finished. She wasn't going to let Audra keep the life she believed she deserved. She wasn't going to watch the Newmans embrace a daughter who wasn't her. Claire Weston was dangerous again. And this time, she wasn't acting out of confusion or trauma. She was acting out of vengeance. She was acting with purpose. And she was acting with the full force of a woman who had already crossed the line between reality and obsession, long before the birthmark ever appeared.